Seem to be having a good time. And you know what? You're right.
Your morning routine just got better. CBS Mornings, weekdays at 7.
Okay, let's go.
You guys good?
Hey.
All right, we good?
Keep going.
The clock, it's ticking.
Off we go.
60 minutes. 60 minutes.
60 minutes.
It's time for 60 Minutes, Sundays on CBS.
Hello, everyone. I'm Lana Zach. Thanks for joining us on the CBS News Weekender. After 3 months of being stuck in space, Boeing Starliner capsule is undocking from the International Space Station. Well, due to tech issues and safety concerns, NASA has decided that they will send the empty capsule home to Earth, while astronauts Butch Wilmore and Sunita Williams, who actually rode the Starliner up to the ISS, will stay on the International Space Station and return back to Earth in February on a SpaceX rocket. Pat Duggins joins us now from Tuscaloosa, Alabama. He is the news director for Alabama Public Radio. He's been following this story closely. Pat, I am so interested in all of this from even before the Starliner launched Butch and Sunny into space. There was already so much drama with aborted attempts. Let's just talk about what's going to be happening in moments here. How complex is this undocking?
Well, Lana, what NASA is trying to avoid is what happened back in 1997. That was when astronaut Michael Foale was aboard the Russian Mir space station, and it was hit by a runaway cargo craft. Foale was aboard, and he felt the space station go whump, and then all of a sudden there was a whistling in his ears as the oxygen started racing out of the hole that had been created in one of the science modules. So NASA wants a nice, quiet undocking of the Starliner. It's going to back away. No 1997 Mir whump for NASA on this one, hopefully. And then after that, they're going to be able to find out just how serious the thruster problems were that have just been dogging the spacecraft ever since it tried to dock with the International Space Station the very first time.
It just seems like the Starliner has been plagued with so many issues. So we certainly do hope that everything goes smoothly today. Pat, talk to us about what's needed from the space station crew during this undocking procedure. How much are they involved? Are they involved at all?
Well, they're watching and they're observing, and they'll be taking myriad pictures. When the space shuttle, for example, was lost in 2003 and they resumed flights to the International Space Station, all kinds of observations, all kinds of photography was done to see what was going on with the spacecraft, how it was behaving in orbit. Was there any damage at all? And also they're going to be watching, again, those thrusters because, assuming 2 astronauts were aboard this capsule, they would need those thrusters to safely re-enter Earth's atmosphere and then come hopefully to a nice quiet halt at the White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico. But so far, everything else has gone wrong with Starliner, and there's even speculation that it might not even remain in control as it goes into the Earth's atmosphere. We're just going to have to wait and see on that.
So let's talk a little bit more about that, Pat, because it is incredible that at this point that the Starliner is going to be coming back to Earth without its crew at all. Previously, if you wanted to move a vehicle around in space, you needed to have a human basically inside that vehicle. But in this case, it's all going to be remotely operated here on Earth. Talk to us a little bit about the logistics of what goes into that.
Well, autopilot is available on Starliner. It was not fully operational on the space shuttle. There was that space shuttle, as you recall, would land like an airplane. So NASA was able to handle everything except that last 30 feet before the wheels touched the ground. You had to have somebody inside the spacecraft with their hand on the control stick to make sure everything went okay. But what's going to happen with Starliner is it's going to be kind of hearkening back to Apollo and Gemini, where the gumdrop-shaped vehicle that you see now on your screen is going to re-enter the atmosphere with the blunt end of the spacecraft with a heat shield, shielding the inside of the spacecraft from that 3,000 degrees of heat as the vehicle rubs against the atmosphere going toward the Earth. And then once it gets through the heat of reentry, then you're going to have parachutes that are going to pop out. But the difference is, if any of your parents or grandparents remember Apollo, those vehicles splashed in the ocean. What's going to happen is this vehicle is going to float down toward New Mexico, and then at the very last minute, deploy inflatable airbags that are going to just gently cushion that last few feet as the vehicle bumps onto the ground. Now, they tested that before to make sure that if humans were in there, the bump would be serious enough to injure them. They think that's okay. But right now, with all the problems with the thrusters, they want to make sure that it goes through the atmosphere, that the parachutes work fine. There was an issue with an earlier test flight with the parachutes, and then the airbags work, and then everything just after midnight tonight comes to a nice, quiet, and hopefully uneventful landing for NASA.
And hopefully this is uneventful. It was interesting to me, Pat, that during the press conference in which they announced that this was going to, and actually, I want to pause on that because as you can see, right now it is happening. It has just undocked from the International Space Station. These are all live images that we are bringing to you, our viewers, right now, as the Boeing Starliner, that beleaguered spacecraft, is finally being sent back to Earth without its crew, Butch and Sunny, who remained there on the International Space Station. But you do see that it has successfully undocked. Now the next tricky part of that, coming back to the Earth, is expected to happen. So, Pat, as you see that successful undocking and the movement away from the International Space Station, what are your immediate thoughts?
Well, for you and your viewers at home, if you see what looks like a hatch with a big door open on it, there we go. That's the part that connected the capsule to the International Space Station. It was a docking module on a node called Harmony that was brought up by the space shuttle and snapped onto the space station years ago. Now, what we're waiting for is if you the next time you switch the photograph over to the side of the vehicle, you're going to see the gumdrop shaped space capsule, but also what looks like a cylindrical skirt at the bottom, at the back of the vehicle. That's the service module, and that's where the big jet thrusters, the big boomers that you might see. In fact, you might notice those little
firing there on the left of your screen.
There you go. That little
Starliner
that's
away from space station.
So the voices that you're
hearing,
hearing, sorry, I just want to explain, the voices that we're hearing, that's NASA TV, so that's what we're hearing from NASA. I want to pause and see if we can hear more guidance from NASA.
Good first burn.
Houston, ISS thrusters enabled.
Confirmation, all 27 jets have fired.
Houston copies, ISS thrusters enabled.
And you're seeing the light show there on your screen.
And the first 3 of the 12 firings have completed, and there's about a 100-second pause until the 4th burn.
Pat, I have to say, I love seeing the burn and those thrusters and actually physically seeing that. And hearing, hearing from NASA what's taking place there, right?
Oh, yeah. Each one of those little pulses of white that you're seeing there are two chemicals, two self-igniting chemicals on the shuttle. It was nitrogen tetroxide and monomethylhydrazine. And what happens is, by themselves, they're corrosive and they're toxic, but when they touch, they ignite. And each one of those little puffs of white that you're seeing there are when the chemicals come together, and each little like that is each thruster pushing just a little bit here, there, all computer controlled. But pretty soon you're going to see depending on when the engine's firing you're going to see that big thrust from the big skirt at the back. That's going to push the capsule into the atmosphere, and that's going to start the trip home.
Burns and the series of firings as part of the breakout burn. As a reminder, the entire sequence will take about 5 minutes to complete.
And we just heard NASA TV reminding that there will be about 5 minutes for this process.
The keep out sphere is an imaginary 200-meter sphere centered on the space station.
And I keep interrupting myself to listen to NASA, actually. So why don't we go ahead and pause a little bit longer and listen to NASA as well.
And you just saw burn 4, which just completed. We're hearing good burn.
We're hearing good burn, Pat. So that's excellent news. Remind our viewers some of the troubles that Starliner has had up until this point, and how excited Boeing executives must be to actually see these things happening as planned.
Well, it's kind of bittersweet for Boeing, Lana, because you see, it's one thing to launch astronauts into space, but it's another thing to bring them home safely. And so Boeing is kind of like getting half the job done. Unfortunately, Butch Williams and Butch Wilmore and Sunita Williams are going to remain aboard the International Space Station. And frankly, they're going to come back on another spacecraft built by another company, SpaceX. So it's almost like Macy's bringing the astronauts up and but the competitor bringing the astronauts home. So and frankly, it's probably even worse for Boeing now because it looks as though, at least at this point, that the vehicle is behaving itself and it is doing what's going on.
Right, and we heard that Boeing had tried to advocate for their ability to bring the astronauts home, but obviously you want to err on the side of safety for all of this. And this isn't the end for Boeing, and this is what I was starting to say before we saw those thrusters starting to ignite. I was very interested to hear that NASA executives NASA and Boeing executives were saying that when they bring the Starliner back, they are going to look at it and hope to put it back into service. So they're hoping that this is, in fact, going to continue to shuttle astronauts back and forth between the International Space Station and Earth. Do you think that there's going to be resistance to that, given this only got half the job done?
Well, it depends if they can find out what's causing the overheating of the thrusters. They had some test vehicles and some test elements on the ground, and it's almost like when you have that squeak in your car and you go to the mechanic and the squeak goes away. Well, that's kind of the squeak that NASA's dealing with right now. If they can fix the overheating so that the thrusters definitely work, you can put astronauts in there. Now, NASA has already contracted with Boeing for a total of 6 manned flights of Starliner, and that's big news in Alabama because the rocket that lofted Starliner to orbit was built in part at a factory just south of Huntsville and Decatur. So it's big news for my state right now. But it just depends whether or not it's going to be safe. And once that's taken care of, then NASA will have another way to get people to orbit, which they really, really want. They don't want to just rely on SpaceX.
Right. It does seem a little bit like the constant problem with IT. Your device isn't working. As soon as you call IT and they touch it, it starts working. So in this case, we are glad, however, that the Starliner appears to be functioning properly. You mentioned that SpaceX is going to be bringing these astronauts home to the Earth in February. Discuss for us a little bit about some of the competition between SpaceX and Boeing.
Well, NASA contracted with both of these companies in order to launch astronauts to and from the space station after the loss of 2003 loss of Space Shuttle Columbia. NASA and the United States and its Congress had to go hat in hand to the Russians and ask them for seats on their Soyuz spacecraft, which NASA paid a rather hefty price for. So now that we've got SpaceX working,
firings have completed.
I'm sorry, Lana, I missed you.
Oh, Pat Duggins, I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining me for this. It has been a real pleasure talking to you and seeing the successful undocking from the International Space Station of the Boeing Starliner capsule. Thank you.
Thank you, Lana.
I'm going to bring in now CBS News space consultant Bill Harwood. He is at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. So, Bill, this was the big thing that we were waiting for all day, watching that undocking of the Boeing Starliner capsule. Of course, it is coming back to Earth without Butch and Sunny, the 2 astronauts that rode it up to the International Space Station. As Pat and I were discussing, so far, everything looks like it is happening as it was expected to happen. What are your big takeaways?
Well, no question about that. You know, the spacecraft is firing its thrusters as required, as programmed, to back safely away from the International Space Station. They just crossed out of what NASA calls the keep-out sphere. This is kind of a safety zone, a buffer zone they maintain around the station. In a few minutes, it'll pass out of what they call the approach ellipsoid. You know, only NASA could come up with these names, but that's an even larger safety zone around the station. And once they get out of that, I think that they're in very good shape indeed. So far, the spacecraft is operating just like you would expect it to if there was a crew on board.
So the approach ellipsoid, the safety zone outside around the International Space Station, the undocking procedure, I imagine that's one tension point. The other one, obviously, as the Starliner re-enters the Earth's atmosphere and faces that intense heat where the heat shield is supposed to protect the vehicle. Are those the 2 inflection points really at this point? Do you expect that anything may potentially go wrong, or are we looking at like 95%, 99% success now that it has undocked and the thrusters are firing as expected?
No, it's way too soon to say that.
All right.
Getting away from the station, as Pat was talking about, to make sure there couldn't be a collision if some jets weren't firing correctly. That's certainly a major milestone, and they've reached that point virtually. No, the deorbit burn is what is required to get them out of orbit. There's no question that the big thrusters, the big rockets on the Starliner, there haven't been any problems with those, so they're almost certainly going to fire. The question is the small thrusters, the one they've had trouble with, will they fire okay to keep it stable during that burn? That's what's required to ensure an accurate trajectory back to the landing in New Mexico. So, that's a big question mark right now, I think, given the past trouble with these things. Now, got to tell you, the Boeing engineers are adamant. They say they don't have any doubt these thrusters will work fine and that the spacecraft will make a normal descent to landing. NASA didn't necessarily argue with that conclusion, but they said they just couldn't be certain enough to risk the lives of the astronauts. So they're playing it safe, sending it back without a crew.
I imagine Sunita Williams and Butch Wilmore appreciate them playing it safe. I'm wondering if we have heard more about what they've been saying about this mission.
We haven't heard directly. They haven't spoken directly to us in several weeks. I think NASA's trying to put together a news conference maybe next week where we can ask them what they think about it. Going from what you thought was going to be an 8-day mission to being told, well, you know what, you're going to have to stay up there for 8.5 months. That's certainly a psychological burden of sorts. But on the other hand, you don't hear any negativity in their voices when they're doing their normal work up there. And all astronauts launch, they expect things like that can happen. They train for it. And so, it's unfortunate it's happened to them, but I don't have any doubt they'll put the time to good use and serve as, just like any other station crew member on board for a 6-month tour of duty.
Well, I imagine if you've been dreaming your entire life about getting to a particular destination, and in that case it's space, you don't mind spending some extra time up there. So Bill, what's next then for the Starliner now?
Well, in the near term, of course, as we just talked about, getting through that deorbit burn and landing, that's a big deal. But once they get the spacecraft back on the ground, you have to remember the only part of this that comes back is the crew module. The service module, the kind of snare drum-shaped white structure behind the crew module, that burns up in the atmosphere intentionally. They jettison it, and it burns up. And that's the component that had the thrusters and the helium leaks. So they're never going to get a chance to, put eyes on that hardware to figure out with 100% certainty what caused these problems in the first place. So you can anticipate months and months of test and analysis after the spacecraft gets back. They're going to have to make sure they go back and look at those thrusters, maybe redesign them. Same with the helium valves that has some leakage. And so the question is, when will it fly again? And I'd be surprised if it flew before the end of next year, if then. I think this is a big hit to Boeing. It's a big hit to this program. Boeing says they're committed to it. It will fly again, but we don't know when that's going to be.
All right. Well, we appreciate you being with us as we watch the Boeing Starliner undocking successfully from the International Space Station on its journey back to Earth. Bill Harwood, thank you.
The team over there will be monitoring the progress of Starliner as it moves to its deorbit.
I want to take you now over to Georgia. There is a visual there, as you can see, of the vigil that's being held in Winder, Georgia, for those 4 victims of the high school shooting that took place at Appalachia High School. I want to bring in now CBS News national correspondent Jerika Duncan. She's there in Winder, Georgia. Jerika, you and I have talked